Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Weiner, Program Manager of Education and Practice at the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. Thank you for joining us for today's ASPPH Presents webinar, Strategies for Effective Teaching of a Target Skill to Undergraduate Public Health Students. These presentations were originally intended for the 2017 Undergraduate Public Health Summit, though we are happy to be able to feature them via webinar today. Today's webinar will be 1 hour in length. We'll begin with a short introduction of our presenters, followed by each presentation and ending with a question and answer period. This webinar is part of the 2017 ASPPH Presents monthly series. It is being recorded and it will be available on the ASPPH website in the archived webinar section soon. Additionally, this webinar has been approved for 1 hour of CPH continuing education credit. A few housekeeping items of note. While you are in listen-only mode and your lines have been muted, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the question box. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. We are pleased to have with us today our speakers, Corrie Paeglow and Tracy Ruscetti. Corrie Paeglow is an assistant professor at George Mason University, the largest public university in Virginia. She holds an MPH from Yale and a DrPH from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Corrie will also be presenting on behalf of Laura Wheeler-Poms, who unfortunately is not able to join us today. Laura Wheeler-Poms is an assistant professor and undergraduate program coordinator in the Department of Global and Community Health at George Mason University. Tracy Ruscetti is a lecturer in biology at Santa Clara University. She is also the assistant director of the public health program in charge of program assessment and faculty development. She earned her PhD from LSU Medical School of Microbiology and Immunology. Her research in quantitative writing began when she was an American Society for Microbiology biology research scholar in residence in 2015. Thank you for being here today, Corrie and Tracy. And Corrie, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm delighted to be able to present on behalf of my colleague, Laura Poms, about developing undergraduate research skills through a scaffolded learning process. At George Mason University, we've had a big emphasis recently on undergraduate research. And in particular, we've thought about research as a scaffolded process where all students come in and we want them to start at the discovery of scholarship level. We want them to understand the value of knowledge and how it's generated and communicated. So really, to make that shift between being high school students where knowledge is just something that you hear about into being college students and understanding the very basics of how that knowledge is generated and shared. As students move along, we then want them to move into the scholarly inquiry stage where they'll engage in elements of scholarly inquiry. So not just how is knowledge generated, but how can I generate knowledge and what are the processes and procedures that go into that. And then finally, as the capstone to this scaffolded process, we want students to have a creation of scholarship experience where they'll create an original scholarly project and also communicate the knowledge that they gained from that project to the broader community. Now, this is a university-wide emphasis on Mason, but it's really great because it fits so strongly with public health and the things that we want our students to achieve. As an evidence-based discipline, it's really important that our students master each of these 3 levels. And so we were super excited to jump onto this and use this as an impetus to redesign our curriculum to better meet our students' continuing needs. So we have about 550 undergraduate community health majors within our department. And as I said, we decided to go for a complete curriculum revision. And we wanted to have one signature assignment in each class so that regardless of who was teaching it, all of the students would complete this assignment and thus demonstrate that they have achieved the learning objectives for the class. Now, we had some particular challenges. There was no clear intro class. Some of our students start by taking an intro global health class. Others jump in intro to public health, so it wasn't clear where to sit that discovery piece. We didn't have a research methods class at the time, which in retrospect was a glaring oversight that I'm glad we've had the chance to correct. And we also realized that we were going to have to change our CAPSTONE course in order to meet that creation of scholarship criteria. All of this took place with the idea of eventually pursuing CEF accreditation in the background, so we were mindful of both these requirements and also what CEF requires. And like many universities, we have staffing challenges. We have sections that are taught by adjuncts, And then we have individual courses that are taught by many different faculty members, which makes it very hard to guarantee a consistent experience where all students are achieving the objectives. What we decided to do was to place our discovery into Introduction to Public Health, and then make Public Health Research Methods our inquiry class, and have our capstone course be our Creation of Scholarship class. Apologies for that duplicate slide. So in the Introduction to Public Health class, this is a class that our students take, and it's also taken by students in the health administration major. So there's multiple sections with multiple instructors, and we found it really challenging to respect faculty members' individuality and different approaches while also having common things that students are achieving across the sections. We dealt with this by having only one or potentially two common assignments across the sections and not overburdening faculty with too many directives so that they could, follow what they wanted to do as well. Some of the faculty members are adjuncts, which we love our adjuncts. They do really great work, but they're often a little more pressed for time than our full-time faculty are and a little more challenging to connect with. And common assignments and having common rubrics and things like that were challenging to implement. We were able to team really successfully with our adjuncts. In fact, one of the co-authors on this presentation is an adjunct faculty member who teaches this class, so we're pretty proud of that. In terms of the research student learning outcomes, there's a whole other set of non-research learning outcomes. We hoped that by the end of the class, students would be able to distinguish between personal beliefs and evidence, understand how knowledge is transmitted within a discipline across disciplines into the public, and evaluate credibility of source information, which I think we all see in society around us today that this is an increasingly important skill to have. And so we're happy that we have the opportunity to tackle it head-on in this introductory course. And then the assignment that we use to evaluate whether students have met this criteria is a literature search and annotated bibliography. So we want to see that students can actually find the literature and read it, at least at a very beginning level. We don't expect them to get too deep into the evaluation of the research. That takes place in the next class. And so we have them find 5 research articles and then develop an annotated bibliography that includes a little bit of analysis of the text. We found that the assignment works really well. It works especially well because we have students work on it in stages, and as they practice these different stages of the assignment, they really begin to see the value of it. And so what we learned by establishing this new version of the class is we need to be careful deciding how and when we pilot an assignment. It required a lot of conversation and negotiation with different faculty members. We needed to make sure we were well prepared, things like that. Keep in mind your own time constraints. Because this is an intro class, it's really big, so we could have asked for 10 papers, but we realized that 5 is probably enough of a learning experience for the students, and it makes things really manageable on our side too. And it's crucial to partner with adjunct faculty. They are critical, and if we engage them in the development process, they're going to be more engaged and invested in the final product. So we're really pleased that we have strong adjunct faculty and that we were able to work with them in this way. After students finish this class, they move along, sometimes right away, sometimes not, into the inquiry class, which is a public health research methods class. This was a totally new class that we were building. It builds on our discovery course. It's taught by multiple full-time faculty members, and we're required to assess it as part of our university level assessment. Those were some of the challenges we faced in developing it. By the end of the course, we wanted students to be able to articulate a scholarly question, follow ethical principles, gather evidence appropriate to the question, and apply the basic concepts and methods of public health data collection and analysis. And here again, we've got a combination of SEEF learning outcomes and Mason-specific learning outcomes. We really tried to incorporate both of these things as much as possible to make it easier to achieve everything we want to achieve. We have a number of assignments that help us reach these goals, and some of these are not graded assignments, they're more in-class activities. For every study design that we discuss, students practice designing that particular type of study. So we'll have a week that's like case control week. I'll teach them about case control studies, we'll read and discuss a case control study, and then they'll design one as well. We also do a design 2 ways exercise where students have one research question and they have to use 2 different study designs to answer it. A personal favorite, I think students get a lot out of that. We have students look at particular data collection tools and critique them. We look at a food frequency questionnaire, we look at a visual analog scale, we talk about the strengths and weaknesses and the quality of data that we're going to get. And the students also have to understand and critique research papers, which is actually the subject of my presentation, which is next, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. So you can see that we have our assessment criteria here, and our target was that 75% of students would score 80% or better. What we got after our first semester of collecting the data was 69% achievement of the target, but we had pretty significant variability across the sections, and each section was taught by a different instructor that semester. So we had some concerns about inter-rater reliability. Maybe just by having an open-ended question with sort of a broad rubric, we were having equal levels of achievement, but the faculty members were rating them differently. Or we also thought it was possible that our question was ambiguous, and that's why students weren't doing as well as they thought they would. Hard to write a good question. I don't think I appreciated when I was in college just how challenging it was for my professors. So what we learned from teaching this class is it's important to get students into the literature early and to get them practicing. And again, more on that in my presentation. In addition, if you're going to do assessment across different sections, it's really a good idea to have assessments that are not very subjective. And so what we did is we moved to multiple choice questions for assessment because we felt that this better allowed us to have a common standard across all the classes, and it eliminated our inter-rater reliability issue, which was really important for us. The final class in our scaffolded curriculum is the creation of scholarship in the community health capstone course. So this is a senior level synthesis class that includes career development, and it's a writing intensive class. So there's a lot of things that are in this class, and all students have to take it. It's a major requirement, and every student at Mason has to take either a capstone or a synthesis class. When we started making these changes, we realized that we had some sequencing challenges. Students often take classes when they're convenient for them and not when they fit well into the curriculum. And so we had students who were getting into community health capstone who were maybe taking research methods the same semester, capstone even before they'd taken research methods, which doesn't fit with our scaffolded approach at all. So we definitely changed prerequisites and made them a little more enforceable and enforced so that we could combat this issue. And once again, we have multiple sections with multiple instructors. So that's a theme across all of our classes, and I'm sure for many of you it is as well. And how do we deal with that in a way that helps us respect instructors' individuality and what they bring to the table while ensuring a common experience for everybody? The student learning outcomes we hope to achieve in this class, we want the students to articulate and refine a focused and manageable challenge that may contribute to the field, acquire information or data using effective, well-designed strategies, consistently use appropriate criteria to judge the credibility of evidence. And here you really see the scaffolding. We started in the discovery class talking about assessing the quality of evidence, and now we expect students to have built to using appropriate criteria to judging the credibility of that kind of evidence. And then also identifying relevant ethical issues related to their research or practice. We're still working on this aspect of things, and in fact, this is one of my main tasks this summer is to complete this scaffolded curriculum and develop the community health capstone syllabus and then teach it. What we plan to do right now is we are thinking we're going to use a case competition approach where students will be presented with a public health problem. This semester we're going to be focusing on healthy aging and keeping seniors at home and active and in good health. And they'll have to develop a solution to this case that will be presented in a 15-minute presentation to a panel of judges. We think that this is a really nice way to take research because hopefully they'll be looking at evidence-based programs and strategies for achieving what they hope to achieve and applying it to development of a solution to this problem. And We feel that that's a very real-life kind of scenario, the kind of thing they might be called upon to do in their future career. So like I said, we'll be piloting it this summer, starting in about a week. So wish me luck as I go through that process. So what did we learn through this process, and what do I hope you can take away from this talk? The first thing is that scaffolding works. We really do see that students are achieving more and doing better as they go through the scaffolding process. But you have to scaffold very carefully. Sequencing is really important. You might have to use prerequisites and enforcement of those prerequisites to make sure that students are where they need to be in the process. We're also seeing effects in classes that are not in the sequence. So this sequence sort of forms a core of our curriculum, but we find that it's also helping students in classes like epidemiology. Once they've taken research methods, epi becomes a whole lot easier, for example. So do it, but pay attention to the details to make sure it works effectively. In addition, and I guess this is true for so many processes, begin with the end in mind. Figure out what it is you hope to achieve and how you're going to measure that, and work back from there. And when you think about measurement, really think about ways it can be consistent but not onerous for any individual faculty member. We also found it's helpful to pilot one section if it's possible. It helps you get the kinks out, and it also makes it a little easier to share with other faculty members if you've already had the experience one time. Don't be afraid to change in mid-process. We've done this so many times. At one point, we thought we were going to put our discovery course, our discovery content into our Intro to Global Health class. And we piloted that in one section, and we found out it didn't work. And we course corrected and put it into our Intro to Public Health section instead, where it fits much better. So don't be afraid to make that kind of change, and don't put too much into one class. If your curriculum is like ours, we've got a lot of things we need to cover in terms of having a writing intensive, having a capstone, and meeting other university requirements. If we try to put all those, when we try to put all those things into one class, it doesn't work super effectively. So we've also focused a lot on putting it in different classes. Collaboration is key as well. We've worked with lots of different people to make this happen. So thank you very much. If you're interested in contacting Laura to learn more about this, her contact information is here, and I know that she and all of us would be more than pleased to share our experience with you. We also want to acknowledge that this work was funded by a Mason Students of Scholars Development Grant. And with that, I'll take any burning questions.
Great, thank you so much, Corrie. Yes, we'll address one question that has come in. Person has asked, did you meet any resistance from faculty or professors to implement the common assignment when you first began? And if so, how did you overcome that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When we initially started, most of the faculty who were teaching these classes were engaged in the curriculum redesign process because of that, I think they felt a sense of ownership that helped overcome some of the resistance that they may have felt. Since then, we've had a little bit of resistance, not too much. It's been really helpful to have our chair be on board with this process and to be supportive of it. I think it's also been helpful that there's been kind of a community of practice around these classes, so that it's not just that we're, sending you off to do this thing that we, have never done before and aren't going to support you in, but we provide support for faculty members who are starting to do it. And then another key thing is the common assignments, it's just one per class, which makes it a lot easier than if we were, had a common syllabus throughout the semester.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I just want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions throughout these presentations via the question box, and we will address all the rest at the end.
All right. So now I get to talk again. You guys get to hear what my students go through. But I'm also delighted to have a chance to share my experience teaching the Public Health Research Methods class, and specifically focusing on building undergraduate skills in reading and evaluating research, which again, as an evidence-based discipline, this is super crucial. I think it's one of the key things that we do with our undergraduates is get them to be able to read and evaluate research. My objectives for this section of the talk is that by the end you'll be able to plan a series of assigned readings appropriate for building student skills in reading and evaluating public health research, that you'll have some strategies for teaching students how to read these studies, that you'll have some ideas and strategies for ensuring that students complete their assigned reading, which is the big trick in teaching, and then also how to assess students' ability to read and evaluate research articles. So I always, you know, hearkening back to that idea of beginning with the end in mind, thinking about what we want our students to be able to achieve and why these research skills and reading and interpreting research skills are so important. So we know that some of our students are going to pursue advanced degrees and become researchers themselves someday. So it's pretty obvious why research methods are important to them. But for students who don't aspire to that, which frankly is the majority of our students, I really try to emphasize to them that every professional discipline uses research to inform practice. Whether they end up in public health or human resources or education, they're going to need these skills so that they can understand and apply what the state of the art is. And then also people use research to inform their life decisions. You know, just the other day I was looking at the New York Times health section for some new information about diet. And it's really important to be able to understand and evaluate those sorts of research, or research that's presented in that way that we hope to use to inform what we're doing in our own lives. So those are the reasons we want students to have these skills, but how do we get them to have those skills? Well, the first thing is creating the reading list. And I always find this a little bit daunting because it has to happen before the semester begins, before you even know who your students are and what their interests are going to be. But here are some things I found that are particularly helpful in doing this. First, start simple and work to greater complexity. There are a lot of fairly simple peer-reviewed research papers out there, you know, largely cross-sectional studies, papers that are maybe 3 to 4 pages long that are a really good starting point for students and are often interesting to them. I often assign a paper that's an analysis of youth risk behavior survey data that's about 3 pages long to get us started for the semester. So not terribly complicated. And then once we've built confidence and self-efficacy there, we move on up to more challenging papers as the semester goes along. In addition, I always try to choose papers from a variety of subdisciplines. So some students are very interested in nutrition, and so I always have at least one diet-related paper. Other students might be more interested in pharmacoepidemiology or different things. I want students to have an appreciation for everything that research can do, and so I find that having papers from a lot of different subdisciplines can help with that. Students are really interested in papers that are relevant to them, so a lot of the papers I choose focus on a college age or slightly younger demographic because then they can relate to it and think about it, or issues that students are particularly interested in. One paper I have students read is about peanut consumption in infancy and later peanut allergy. They tend to really like that one because everybody knows somebody with a peanut allergy or has heard about them. The one place that it's really hard to find a paper that meets these criteria is case control studies. A lot of case control studies are pharmacoepi, they use big administrative data. So if anyone has a suggestion for a good case control study, I would love to hear it. I'm always looking for a new one to try. Now, we often assume that students know how to read when they come to our classes, and of course they do know how to read, but they don't necessarily know how to read research papers and the unique skill set that you need in order to do that. For faculty members, we often read and evaluate together because we're so familiar with what we're doing, we don't even need to break it down into steps. But for undergraduate students who are doing this the first time, I take a task analysis approach. I take this complicated skill of reading and evaluating a paper, and I break it down into smaller and more manageable components. The way I do that is by the sections of the paper. So we talk specifically about the background, and then when we dig into the methods, I further subdivide it into what I call the 4 S's of the methods. the study design, the sample, the survey, which means measurement, but you know, I've got my good S alliteration going on, and the statistical analysis, the results, and the discussion and conclusion. And the students are given questions for each section of the paper. So I give them a document that lists, you know, 5 or 6 questions that they should consider as they're reading the background, 5 or 6 questions they should consider as they're thinking about the study design. And the idea is if they can answer all of these questions, then they'll have a good understanding of the paper. We spend a whole class period explicitly walking through this set of questions and applying them to a fairly simple paper that all the students have read. So I model how to use them in class, and then I encourage students to continue to refer back to that as they go. It's also important to note that the results section has to be read somewhat differently, and I find that I need to explicitly teach students how to read the results section. That's primarily because I want them to look at the tables first rather than the text, which is the opposite of how we tend to think about reading things in English. So I very explicitly tell them to look first at the tables, and then also every table is different, and so I emphasize to them that they need to orient themselves to the format of the table before they can really start looking at and understanding the data that the table contains. So, you know, a table looks like it should be relatively easy to understand, but sometimes you spend more time on it than you would an equivalent section of text. And we need to explicitly teach students that because it's not something that they are going to intuitively do based on their previous experience with reading. To give you a sense of the type of questions I ask about a particular section, when I'm asking them to think about the sample, I ask them to think about what was the population, how were the participants recruited, how many participants were there. If it's a descriptive study, was the sample representative? If it's an analytic study, were the groups as similar as possible? Were there losses to follow up? If so, how many people and what percent? And you can see it's just 5 questions. It's not too complicated, but if you can answer these questions, you're probably pretty clear on who was included in this particular study and how good a job they did in getting that population. Now, I also emphasize for students that practice is really important, that nobody ever got taught a skill and did it once and had it mastered. And so they need to practice their skills in reading the research literature like they would practice any other skill. I also provide lots of opportunities for practice. We probably read about, I'd say 9, maybe 10 papers across the course of the semester, which at the undergraduate level is a pretty significant amount of research literature to read, especially since this isn't a senior level course necessarily. And I also ensure that they're doing the practice, that they're actually developing the skill. What I do is for every paper that they read, they have to complete a reading response assignment. This is no more than 200 words, and it's a really brief summary of the article in addition to something that shows me that they engaged intellectually with the article, that the words didn't just go by their eyes and they said, yes, I read it, but that they actually went into their brain and they thought about what they were doing. So for example, sometimes a student will say something like, I don't think they recruited the sample the right way because, and they'll give some kind of justification for that. Or they'll say, the results of this study don't apply to everybody because they only focused on this particular population. Now, in this assignment, I actually don't care whether they're right or not. Sometimes students say things that are a little bit off the wall or not entirely correct. But what I care is that they actually did the reading and they thought about it. So you don't have to be right. You just have to think about it and show me that you did in order to get full credit for the assignment. Because they're really short, they're pretty easy to grade. And I also like it because it allows me to give students individualized feedback on things that they might not quite be grasping and helps me to monitor what they get and what they don't get. So I find it to be valuable on a number of levels. Now, at the end of the semester, once we've gotten really good at just the basics of understanding research papers, then we move on to evaluating internal validity. And here again, this is a task that we sort of do all at once. All at the same time, we consider the study design, the sample, and so on. and come up with our own assessment of internal validity. But I find it's helpful to break it down a little bit more for students. And so what you see on the left side of the screen here is exactly the tool I use. I give them a handout and I say, write down the strengths and the weaknesses of these particular aspects. One thing to note, when you look at data collection here, I divide it into tools and process because I think it's a little bit easier. You might want to keep them together. It's all kind of what works for you. And so we read a paper, and then in class together, we go through what the strengths and weaknesses are in each of these areas. I emphasize that not every box on the chart is going to have something in it, that the chart is just a tool to help organize our thinking. And I also emphasize that there are some things that it's sort of on the border of which category they would fall in. It's not as important to have things in the right box as it is to have things on the sheet overall. And once we've gone through this sheet, I ask the students to rate the paper from 0, meaning no internal validity, to 10, which would be perfect internal validity. Now, obviously, this ranking is not something that you would ever see in the professional literature, but I think it helps students to conceptualize what they're trying to do and why the assessment matters. It matters because it helps us to understand if we should have confidence in the results of this paper, if the paper has internal validity. I also emphasize that there's no right rating. A paper that I justify as, or a paper that I rate a 9, you might give an 8. What's important is that they're able to justify the particular rating that they give. And just one common pitfall that comes up here is that students often conflate internal and external validity. So as we're going through this exercise in class, I would say I spend most of my time encouraging them to remember the difference between those two things. Speaking of external validity, so after we've, excuse me, after we've assessed internal validity, then we switch to external validity. Students often find this easier, and I agree, it's easier to think about who the results apply to than thinking about whether the results are correct or not. So it's important in this stage to note that we always want to assess internal validity first, and that if a study doesn't have internal validity, it's not really worthwhile to consider its external validity. We wouldn't want to apply the results of a bad study. Because students find this easier, this is typically one of the last things we do in the semester, and it doesn't take us that long, usually about a half hour, maybe a little more if we want to have an intense discussion of it. The culminating assignment for this class, it's a 2-part assignment. It's about 6 pages long. I give students a couple of research articles to choose from, and they have to pick from mine. They can't choose their own. But in the first part of the assignment, they have to just understand the article. They have to walk through the questions that we have been talking about all semester long and use them to understand this particular article that they've never seen before. And in the second part, they assess the internal validity of the article. And for that section, I really encourage them to show off everything they've learned during the semester. Any vocabulary that they've learned, residual confounding, things like that. This is really their chance to shine and apply all of these ideas to assessing an actual article. And I think it's really successful. I won't read all these examples for the sake of time, but this is an example from a student paper where a student said, another weakness would be the likelihood of residual confounders. Although the cases and controls were chosen from the same place and were as similar as possible, there is still the possibility for other confounders. Not 100% perfect, but really shows a decent understanding of residual confounders and the importance of having cases and controls be as similar as possible. And you can certainly read these other examples. I think they illustrate well the quality of work that students are able to do after following this approach and process. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm always happy to share materials and ideas or take suggestions if this has sparked anything. You're more than welcome to email me, and then my phone number is there as well. None of us is as good as all of us are, so if you're interested in engaging on these issues, I'd love to have the opportunity to share ideas and bounce things around. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Corrie. Several of the questions have asked, several of the participants have asked that they could have a copy of your syllabus, so I'm sure you'll be hearing hearing from them. One of the questions, the burning question, is about student feedback. You did note that they have obviously learned a lot. Did they enjoy it? Have they noted that they've applied these newly learned skills in other courses, or just general information about feedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. Every so often, I would say once or twice a semester, I get one of those great emails from a research methods students where they say, I was reading this article in the paper, or I was reading this article in a magazine at the doctor's office, or something like that, and it was talking about research, and I had all these questions about it, and I found out that it wasn't a good study after all. Those kinds of emails that make teachers' days, right? So I think for some students who are really interested and engaged, it does have an impact far outside of the classroom and spills over into their everyday interactions with research. One thing I do highlight for the students consistently is how much they've learned. Like by the time we start reading the third paper, I'm like, hey guys, you wouldn't have understood any of this when the semester started, and now you do. And I think that's really cool because it continues to build their self-efficacy, and then self-efficacy leads to achievement, which leads to greater self-efficacy. So I think it often does have this effect, especially for students who attend class regularly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to turn it over to Tracy.
Am I on?
You are.
Okay. So thanks so much, Sarah, for putting this together. I think it's a great way to get over a snowstorm. So I want to just point out the people who are involved. This is me. I'm Tracy Ruscetti. This is my colleague, Christelle Sabatier. This is Katie Kruger, and this is Kat Saxton. We are all in the biology department at Santa Clara University, and Kat and I are also in the public health science program here on campus. So I want to start, we really are interested in how students can communicate in a written form their ideas of quantitative information. And so I want to talk a little bit about why it's important. Sarah, can you give me the keyboard? Thank you. So why do we care about quantitative writing? Well, clearly writing is a primary mode of communication. Even on exams, we're asking students to write to show their understanding of the material or their ability to wrap their brains around quantitative information. Unfortunately, students really struggle to write well and to communicate their ideas, clearly especially when they're dealing with quantitative information. Specifically, instructors find it really difficult when students are writing poorly, whether it is about the writing quality itself or whether the underlying reasoning is driving that, the sort of confused communication. When we don't understand things, and it's difficult to figure out whether it's a writing problem, instructors tend to make a lot of assumptions about their students' understanding, and sometimes that's good. We kind of give them a little bit of a benefit of the doubt, or we can, if it's too poorly written, we just say, well, you must not understand that, and we move on. And it is those biases that we bring in that lead to some of the problems that Corrie was talking about, which is that not all instructors have the same level of bias, nor do they apply their bias equally, and so students often find or feel that they are being judged differently by different instructors, and that can be a problem. And I think what the primary reason why I took this on is because it is really painful to read poor writing in our students. And I think that we all have had the soul-crushing experience where we are faced with reading 100 papers and all of them are not written in a way that helps us. So I don't think I need to belabor the point, but it's very clear that public health is, and public health practice uses a lot of writing and communication. And if I think about it, it turns out that quantitative writing, writing about numbers and values and data, are often part of the kinds of writing that happens in public health. So we started looking at all of these kinds of writing. I looked at hundreds of examples of quantitative writing, and what I found was that almost all of them were based in a comparison between two conditions. So whenever there was some sort of number involved, it usually was some sort of comparison. For example, there are 10% more first-generation students at X school compared to Y school, or X behavior increases lung cancer risk threefold compared to Y behavior. And I think these kinds of statements were so prevalent and so pervasive that it led us to name them, and we decided to name them quantitative comparative statements. So whenever there was some sort of number, there seemed to also be some sort of comparison. So to sort of set ourselves up to think about how ubiquitous this may be, I looked at 3 pan-scientific journals, Nature, Science, and PNAS, and I looked at every article in those journals and asked the question, how many of them have quantitative comparative statements in them somewhere? And with only one exception about qubit computing, which I don't even know how to think about that, there was quantitative comparative statements throughout. And in fact, it was irrespective of whether the paper was written for physical science, natural science, or social science. So this is in the professional realm, and so I think if we all thought back to the kinds of things that we care about and the kinds of things we've asked our students to do, we are always asking students to make these sort of quantitative comparative statements. So let me give you an example of 2 student writing samples about a quantitative comparative statement. In this case, this is an upper division social science statistics course in which the students were asked to compare the effect of 2 math programs on test scores. And in the first one, the math program also has a main effect on test scores because the new program shows test score averages that are higher than the old program. And if you read the second one, what you find is that they're talking about the same thing. It's a comparison between an old and new program, and that the new program seems to be better. The second one talks about statistically significant, which is nice. The first one does give some numbers, but they sort of regurgitate the test scores. And these are the kinds of things that we have problems with, and that they are, what do we have to know, what assumptions do we have to make in order to determine whether these students actually have some level of understanding of the underlying test that they were performing, their underlying calculation. So we asked the question, I asked the question back in 2015, what if these kinds of quantitative comparative statements could stand alone? In other words, could I pull out a quantitative comparative statement from any place and the reader would be able to understand what was happening in that statement? So I started looking at thousands, and I don't usually use this term because I'm in California and it's overused, but I literally looked at thousands and thousands of these statements. And what I came up with was a set of criteria, a set of critical components that have to be in place in order for a quantitative comparative statement to be well written. So the first is the calculation, and that is the quantitative relationship between the 2 things that you're comparing. And this relationship isn't just a regurgitation of the actual numbers from the 2 things that you're comparing, but actually some sort of relationship between them. The context is really what is it that you are relating. So for example, if you say 5 times more, which would be the calculation, 5 times more what would be the context. And if you think about the context in the case of anything that our students are producing for us, often the context is left out because students know they're answering a very specific question. So I want to make sure that it turns out in order for these statements to stand alone, context has to be there. The comparison itself is something that we, kind of a rule that we came up with, was that the comparison had to be between 2 and only 2 elements, and we know that it's important to do that because even though it's possible to compare one thing to many things, like this is greater than that, that, and that, it turns out that muddies the statement a little bit. So again, it's the idea, can this statement stand alone? And in this case, having the statement stand alone requires that you make simple pairwise comparisons. And then the last piece is that all of these things need to be present, they need to be in the same sentence, but they need to also have no redundancies within them and no contradictions. And if you can have those pieces in place, then you have a very clear statement. So these are our criteria, and we call them 4C. So I'm going to shortcut this into calling these things 4C. Okay, so how can we use this to help our students? Because ultimately what we want is to help them become better writers. So we have used the 4C framework to come up with an in-class activity in which we asked the students to basically annotate their own statements. And so this is a slide that Kat Saxton, it was a slide. This is a slide that Kat Saxton used in her Public Health Science 1 class. And this is essentially the in-class activity. So in gray is the quantitative comparative statement, and then she walked the students through the process. And so our first process in annotating in a 4C statement is to find the relational phrase or the calculation. So if you read the statement, in Brazil, people living in low-income neighborhoods are 5 times more likely to contract Zika virus than people living in high-income neighborhoods. The relational phrase or the quantitative relationship between your comparison is 5 times more likely. And the point here, the annotation, is to put a box around it. Next, you need to find the context. So 5 times more likely what? And in this case, contracting Zika virus is 5 times more likely. So the context in this case is the contracting Zika virus, and so we put a circle around that. That's our annotation. And then the comparison is what 2 things or groups are being compared, and in this case, people living in low-income neighborhoods versus people living in high-income neighborhoods, and you just simply underline those. And when you ask students to check for clarity, all components are there, yes, and they are in the same sentence or approximate, yes, there's no redundancies or contradictions, no, and so then you can say this statement is very clear. So this took us about 1.5 minutes to go through. This is about how much time Kat took. We've implemented this teaching intervention in about 6 different classrooms, and it has worked to be about 1.5 minutes to 3 minutes, depending on how fast or slow you go. And then Kat's next thing was to ask her students to practice fixing, I guess is the best way to put it, statements that were not that great. So in this case, we're going back to the statements that are about the effect of 2 math programs on test scores, and she had the students go through the annotation process, so this is them practicing the annotation process. So if you look for the calculation or the relational phrase, in this case, our higher than is as close as we get. We don't just look for the numbers, we're looking for the relationship, and so higher than is really the important piece. However, there's no magnitude here. There's nothing that tells us how much higher. And so in this case, this particular statement does not meet the criteria for calculation. So next we look for the context. What is the context here? What is higher? In this case, it's the test score averages, and we circle those. And then, of course, we go back and underline our comparisons, which is the new program versus the old program. And so when students do this, they recognize right away that they are missing the magnitude in the calculation so that they can fix this statement very quickly. And the reason that it doesn't work for the students to just have the numbers regurgitated from the table is that you're asking your reader to actually do the calculation to figure out the magnitude of that relationship. And so trying to, again, get the statements to stand alone and help the reader as much as possible. So let's do the other one very quickly. So again, we're looking for the relational phrase. And here the people tend to score better. This is as close as we get. That's not a very good calculation. It doesn't have magnitude in it as well. And so that doesn't meet our criteria. We look for context in this case. The context is they score better. This is a little problematic because they've changed the noun test scores into a verb score, and that makes it a little more difficult for the reader. And then if we look for their comparisons, that they are comparing the new curriculum to the old. They do talk about the results being statistically significant, but without some sort of magnitude. The statistics do not really inform the reader as much, except to say that if I was to give you this information, it would be statistically significant. So if we give this feedback to the students, they can immediately see that they're missing the magnitude and that they could probably do better in their context. So what are the outcomes when we provide? So basically you have seen in the last 3 to 4 minutes, you've seen our entire classroom intervention, and it makes a huge difference for our student writing. I've seen it in multiple classrooms, and I'm particularly talking about Kat's class right now because she's teaching Public Health Science 1. And what she noticed was that students automatically checked their writing. She didn't, after the first intervention, she did not talk about write a quantitative comparative statement and use 4C. She just said write a sentence describing your data. And students were automatically putting into 4C. I was in her classroom 2 weeks after the intervention, and students were orally presenting some information, and they automatically translated the 4C idea, the quantitative comparative statement, into their oral communication. It was amazing to see. Once we have this in place, I can go in, anyone can go in, instructors can look at these statements and provide explicit and very useful feedback for students, and that is really the biggest piece for us. And once students start writing really good statements, instructors can then start to parse between good writing and the underlying reasoning, which has not been, it has not been easy to do that in the past. All right, so that's the teaching intervention, and if anything, if all we get here is a sense of how to help students write, I think that's enough. But I do want to point out that we've used 4C as a measurement tool as well, and I want to show you how we do that and what sort of data that we get from that. So we're going to come back to a simple statement in which people are exposed to secondhand smoke. People exposed to secondhand smoke are 2 times more likely to develop a cardiovascular disease. We go through our 4C coding process again. So relational phrase is boxed, the context, and if they, have that with magnitude and direction, then they get a plus. And then we go to context, and in this case, cardiovascular disease, they have the context, they get a plus. If they have 2 and only 2 comparisons, they get a plus. And if everybody's together, there's no contradictions or redundancies, they also get a plus. So this particular statement would score a 4. However, a statement that we see all of the time, people exposed to secondhand smoke are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease. The calculation in the phrase more likely is meant to be a quantitative comparative statement, but there is no magnitude in this case. And so they get a minus. If we look at the context, which in this case would still be cardiovascular disease, they have a plus. And then we look for their comparisons, and we can see that there's only 1. People exposed to secondhand smoke are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease compared to whomever. And since they don't have 2 and only 2, then they get a minus for that. And because not all elements are present, then you get another minus in their clarity. And so this particular statement would score a 1. So that basically sets up how we use 4C coding as a measurement. And so what I'd like to do is show you a class. Let me kind of back up a little bit. We went back, once we figured out how to measure writing, we went back and asked if we had improved writing when we had done an intervention that was not 4C related, but rather it was an intervention in which we focused in on quantitative comparative statements and asked whether or not students could improve with our feedback and continued sort of focus. And what we see is that, in fact, we can improve their writing as measured by 4C, even if all we do is talk about quantitative comparative statements and try to provide feedback. And I want to contrast that to the 2 classes that I brought up today. One is this upper division social science statistics course, and the other is this Public Health Science 1 class. In the upper division social science statistics course, the instructor is really keen to get students to write better. And he asked students, and if you could see me, I would be air quoting, wrap words around their calculations. And he does that all quarter. But his feedback is related to say more, or what about population means, but he doesn't help them explicitly make those those changes and that feedback is not very explicit. And when we measured statements from his final, we see that their average score is about a 1, which is really low in comparison to what we've seen before. In contrast, our Public Health Science 1 students who've been given a teaching intervention in which the sentence structure was really focused on, the students in their final had comparative statements that were scoring above 3. And what that tells us is that the focus sentence level structure, the focus on sentence level structure really does make a difference. And it is this feedback, this very targeted, very explicit feedback is what makes a huge difference. And even though the students were never told again, you have to write a 4C statement, they automatically did that. And what we think that does is it gives our students the ability to focus on the underlying reasoning because the structure of the statements are taken care of. And once they start writing really good statements, we can start assessing them and their underlying reasoning. I think this is really important. And in our this last iteration of our course, now that they're writing really good comparative statements, really good evidence statements, now we can start to think about the organization of bigger level writing, such as paragraphs and overall organization. So this has really changed our entire sort of approach to teaching. So I'm going to take that burning question, and I just want to point out that the American Society for Microbiology Biology Research and Resident Scholar Program has really changed my life. And so this has been my baby, my passion for the last couple of years, but it has been an amazing ride. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I know that writing is becoming even more of a focus for everyone as students come in with varying levels of writing experience and aptitude. So one person asked, well, I said that this is reminiscent of diagramming sentences in middle school. Do you have other ideas going forward for improving other components of writing? You did mention overall paragraph structure, but other kind of sentence structure, honing in on those things as well.
So what we found, and I think it's a totally reasonable question, and I think the idea of diagramming sentences, you know, I hated diagramming sentences, and so this is not pulling it all apart in the same way, because I think the underlying grammar is more difficult. I think it is. But what diagramming sentences do and what this annotation does is provide this sort of one level of structure. And once the students don't have to focus on that because they don't have to try to figure out how to write that every single time, then they are free to be better at organizing at the paragraph level. And so we have scaffolded the idea of, okay, now that you've written an evidence statement, we'd like you to start it off with the question or the conclusion, depending on, what section you're writing about, and then pairing the conclusion with this evidence. And then once they've paired conclusion with evidence, then it's to organize your conclusion statements into your paragraph. And then once you've decided which statements go in, that has been really helpful for them because they now have a structure to follow. It's kind of like once they've written in this way, they don't have to think about that anymore. Now they can move it as a block. It's been really helpful.
That's wonderful. Thank you. We have time for maybe a few more questions. I think this might be for Corrie. The question: how do you build in skills, activities, et cetera, for programs, interventions, solutions that are non-evidence-based? And evidence, for example, an evidence-based does not exist for many populations by race, ethnicity, emerging diseases, et cetera.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think we probably address that more in our program planning class than we do in our research methods class, simply because we don't have time to really address that in research methods. But what I do in that class is, if there's no evidence base, I really encourage students to use health behavior theories appropriately to develop, interventions and ideas.
Great, thank you. And this is about the multiple choice quiz that's given across sections. Is it the same multiple choice question and answers given across sections and semesters, or does it change? And I guess this person is kind of getting at fear of students sharing questions with each other.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We do use the same question across years. The students are never given a copy of those questions to keep, so they probably, they'd have to be very creative to come up with ways to share them. Mm-hmm. And in addition, they don't know that we're using these for assessment in particular, so they'd have no particular reason to share these, if that makes sense.
Of course, yes, thank you. And then Tracy, how do you go about grading or giving students grades about if they're making the right comparisons or the right calculations? Oh, sorry, hold on. All right, go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And in fact, I spent a year trying to figure out what the critical components of a good quantitative comparative statement were, and I really struggled because what I struggled with primarily was whether something was right or not right. And so we have left that, the moment we left right versus not right, are they making the right comparisons or the right calculations, just the presence of those things has shifted our frame. And so once they write it well, then we can go back and ask, did they write correctly? And so grading things about correctness is something that comes and is separate from 4C coding or 4C annotation, because in that way the correctness value is something that only the instructor might be capable of assessing appropriately, but anyone can assess whether all of those elements are present. And it completely changed how the coding system, then it could be a measurement tool. It really did open it up. So we fought against the is it correct or not correct for a long time, but now it's like do 4C and then assess for correctness.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end this as we are coming up on the end of our hour. I want to say thank you very much to presenters, Corrie and Tracy, and thank you to all of our participants today. I do want to remind everyone this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the ASPPH website in the near future. You will receive an email when that is ready, up and available for viewing. And additionally, the handout is the PDF of the slides available for download immediately in the GoToWebinar dashboard that you have on your computer right now. And I also want to alert you to some other upcoming webinars, a few of them, the one on July 13th and the one on actually all three of the ones that are coming up in the next few months were originally scheduled for the Undergraduate Summit. So please do go to the ASPPH website to check those out and register when those links become available. And thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.